The hardest part of language learning is the first 50 to 100 hours because you can't feel it working and you're not even sure what it should feel like. And that's a brutal deal to sign up for. You were told that all you have to do is listen to the language at a level you understand, don't focus too much on study, don't focus too much on grammar, just get your hours in with stuff you understand. So that's what you're doing. And for weeks or even months, the reward for all your effort is nothing happening at all. You start to ask, is this actually working? Am I too slow? Maybe I just have a shitty memory. Maybe I'm just not a language learning person. This is where people quit. I want to break down why this whole thing feels so impossible at the start, because once you understand what's actually happening under the hood, it becomes much easier to stick with. And then at the end, I'll give you a handful of concrete things that you can do to make the beginner stage less brutal. The first problem here is that beginners simply don't know what it feels like to understand a second language. You've only ever had to understand one language your entire life. And in that language, since you can remember, understanding it has meant just one thing. Someone talks and the meaning is just there. It's instant, it's effortless, and it's perfectly clear. You don't decode your native language, you don't translate it, it just arrives in your head fully formed. So without even realizing it, that's the bar that your brain is holding your second language to. You sit down to watch beginner content and some part of you is waiting for this crystal clear understanding of meaning that you're accustomed to in your native language. And then when that doesn't arrive, your brain says, I didn't get it. But that's the wrong bar. After 1,200 hours of Spanish, the language still isn't as clear to me as English is. It's not that I don't understand native content, it's not that I'm uncomfortable, it's just a bit more fuzzy. And one of the most important skills we develop as fluent speakers is a tolerance to that. We learn that we don't have to demand clarity from each word that goes by us. And with that tolerance, we're able to understand native audiobooks and native speakers in a similar way to how we understand our native language, without having to constantly try to decode every single little thing. What would be great is if I had a way to show you what this fuzzy comprehension feels like, a way to show you what it's like to understand a foreign language without you having to get to a high level in a foreign language first. Now, if you speak Spanish, you can kind of already do this with Portuguese. When a Spanish speaker listens to Portuguese, they can sometimes get a lot of the message even though they don't really know any of the words because of how similar the languages are to each other. But for native English speakers, this just doesn't exist. Or so you think. It actually does exist. There's actually a close living relative of the English language, and that language is called Scots. Most people have never heard of this language. I think listening to Scots is a great way to show you how comprehension will feel, so you actually know what you're shooting for. So this is the best clip I found on YouTube of a native speaker speaking Scots.
Well, you see now, there was a lot of fisher folk in the northeast, and you ken there was awful holy folk these days. And this skipper was wanting a man for his boatie. There was a young man that was short, you ken. Along came this loon and he says, no, he says, do we smoke? He says, do we smoke? He says, oh, he says, no. He says, I don't smoke it, ta. He'd never touch it at all. He says, well, fit about drink. Oh no, he says, I wouldn't touch it. That's a devil's thing altogether. No, I wouldn't have a drink it.
To me, this exercise is very interesting. You didn't catch every word. It was probably a bit ambiguous, but you could probably follow the message pretty well. Even though it was in another language, you didn't get lost. And notice you weren't translating because you didn't have time to. It was coming at you at full speed. You have no time to translate. So your brain just grabbed what it could and ran with it. This is what developing your fluency in another language is going to feel like once you get past the absolute beginner stage. That kind of fuzzy, I get the gist feeling is exactly what we're going for when we're talking about second language comprehension. It's very similar to how you probably would have interpreted English when you were still learning it as a child. You don't consciously know any of the grammar, you couldn't give strict definitions for each of the words, but your brain can still follow the message. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to watch the whole thing, because honestly, for absolute beginners, it might be a good exercise of just testing your tolerance to ambiguity. How okay are you with just trying to follow the message in a different language, even one super similar to your own? And here's what I'm trying to show you with that exercise. Just because you don't have 100% clarity when you're listening to beginner content doesn't mean you're not improving. You're probably already understanding the language to a decent extent, you're just not giving yourself full credit because, again, it doesn't feel as concrete or as clear as your native language. But that's totally normal. The whole idea of building your comprehension by listening to the language at a level you understand is going from a low resolution comprehension up to a high resolution comprehension. But even when you are improving, you can't always feel it. And that's the second reason that language learning can feel so impossible. Because progress in a language doesn't follow a step function. Instead, it follows a sigmoid curve. We're wired to expect a step function. Put in the work, level up, feel the difference, repeat. That's how traditional subjects work. But language doesn't pay out like that. For a long time, you put your hours in and the progress isn't immediately obvious. It's more like slow and steady compounding. I ran a poll on my channel recently asking when it was that people found that listening to the language started to feel like it was working. And 73% of people said they didn't feel it until after 50 hours. 50 hours. Think about what that means. You could watch beginner content an hour a day, every single day, for almost 2 months before you get your first real hit of, oh, this is working. But like I said, it isn't a step function. The person at hour 0 and the person at hour 49 are not at the same level simply because they both don't feel any progress. The hour 49 learner doesn't just magically leap to a new level of understanding once they hit 50 hours. That's simply when the accumulation of all those tiny improvements became noticeable. The reality of language acquisition is that it's an entirely unconscious process. So feeling yourself get better is genuinely difficult. Think about all the things your mind has learned without you ever trying to consciously learn them. Your route to work, your mom's face, how to recognize a song you like in the first couple seconds. Nobody drilled those into you, and you probably never felt yourself learning them. Your brain just absorbed them through exposure. Acquiring a language is the exact same process, it just takes substantially longer. One of my biggest worries when I started language learning was, how the hell am I gonna remember all of these words? I have a horrible memory. I literally have a horrible memory, terrible. How am I going to hold an entire second language worth of words inside of my head? I want to take that fear apart because I think it's based on a misconception of how our memory works. Imagine I sat you down, gave you infinite time, and asked you to write out every word you know in your native language, every single one. Eventually, you'd run dry and you'd hand me your list. Now imagine I took that list and started reading you words that weren't on it. How many words could I read to you that you know but simply forgot to write down? Or in other terms, how many words do you know that you can't actively recall? Do you think it's 10% of your vocabulary? Do you think it's 20%? Personally, I'd be shocked if it was less than 50%, and that's in your native language. That's the part people miss. Your ability to understand a word is way, way deeper than simply your ability to recall it. Recall is the tip of the iceberg. Understanding is the entire thing sitting beneath. Your active vocabulary, the words that you can produce on command, that comes and goes. That happens in your native language too. But that foundation underneath simply doesn't come and go. Once that word is rooted through massive amounts of input, it sticks. So when it slips out of your active vocabulary, you don't have to relearn it, you just get it back for free. And that deep understanding that's underneath our ability to recall words, that doesn't really require a good memory in my opinion. From my perspective, an open mind is way more important than a good memory in language learning. The person with perfect memory but a rigid mind, the one who tries to memorize every single word, to translate every single line, who wants proof of progress every time they sit down, that's the person who denies themselves fluency. Because once you hit a certain level of fluency, you realize how impossible and unrealistic that standard is. Someone with an open mind does the opposite. They hear a sentence, only understand about 70% of it, but they're fine with that. Because they trust that their comprehension is adding up, even if they can't physically feel it. That willingness to sit in ambiguity and keep going without demanding immediate proof is the whole crux of reaching a deep, durable understanding of the language fast. But I don't think it's enough to just tell beginners to be open-minded. I was a beginner, and just like everybody else, I demanded clarity. I really wanted to feel like I was making progress. And what changed my mind wasn't a 10-minute video of some guy on YouTube lecturing me on how I should feel. It was simply the result of sticking with Spanish long enough to feel my progress. progress. So let's talk about how to keep showing up, because learning a language is a lot easier when you're not fighting with your brain. Here's 4 practical things that you can do to help ease yourself into listening to a language. The first is to always keep a stable variable. Maybe you only watch a handful of creators, or maybe you only watch a certain genre of content, or maybe you find a few specific series. That way your brain doesn't feel this whiplash of starting from scratch every time you sit down with a new accent, a new voice, new vocab. I think it's helpful to keep at least one thing consistent, and honestly, I still use this rule today. The second thing you can do is to not be afraid of rewatching videos. The more times you watch a video, the more clear the narrative becomes. That alone will help you feel your progress much faster, and this is something that, as I've said before, I did a lot as a beginner. The third is if you find something you actually love, just watch that. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit too hard. If you're obsessed with a certain creator or series or topic, then you'll be willing to pour way more hours into that than you will be into content that just bores you to tears. And finally, I wouldn't be scared of looking up some translations, looking up some grammar, getting some explanations. These things can really just help you get more and more comfortable with listening to the language. The whole goal of the absolute beginner phase is to ease yourself into listening, so you should use whatever you want to use to do that. One super important thing that I often forget to say is use my website Langualytics, because literally, I think this is actually the best way to stay motivated, you know? Like, I built this website for this exact problem, so you can see your comprehension go up in the early phases, and you can get motivated and stay motivated through gamification, because our lizard brains really like gamification. Sometimes I forget to mention that, but I did make a website. And if you're in that first stretch right now, and you feel like nothing's happening, you have to understand, it's not your fault.
It's not your fault.
It's not you. It's the method. It just takes a little bit of time to kind of get going, you know? You're just on this part of the curve, right below the conscious progress line. Once you cross this line, that's when you start to actually feel like you're making progress. As long as you're listening to the language at a level you can mostly understand, you can trust that a fluent version of yourself is already being built. And if you want to go deeper on why listening to the language is such an efficient way to build a deep, durable fluency, I recommend checking out this video here. This is kind of like my grand unified theory of language learning. I've had a lot of fun making that. I will see you there.